the next Battlefield game should be multiplayer only. That's a big statement to make, but it's something that I've been thinking about since the launch of the Combined Arms co-op mode for Battlefield 5 and the subsequent reaction to it. In general, I think you can take Battlefield 5 as the example of perhaps why the next game in the franchise should be multiplayer only, with the amount of issues that it's had. We know that the Battlefield franchise is one that appeals to a huge number of players, and it's steadily grown in popularity over time, with the signature multiplayer experience, that all-out war sandbox, being the centre point. But in recent titles, you can see the focus on multiplayer being somewhat lessened, with new elements outside of that experience being integrated to offer players more to do under the same Battlefield banner. Now, I think that reduced focus has diluted the multiplayer experience. It's held it back, and it's stopped it from being the best that it can be. I think it's time for Battlefield to return to a multiplayer-only experience. Looking back at the history of the Battlefield franchise, you can make the argument that most of the players who bought those games were doing so for the multiplayer experience the games offered. Battlefield 5 is offering players single-player, co-op, multiplayer, and a Battle Royale mode, going far beyond just multiplayer. Yes, of course, there were single-player elements to some of those previous games, and a storyline for players to move through and complete, but I think it's pretty obvious that most people buy Battlefield games for their multiplayer element. It's always been the main focus. The single-player campaigns have very much been a side mode that you can play if you want to relax a little bit, maybe take the pressure off and walk through a story being told about the squad or the characters that are written into it. Would totally removing any kind of single-player mode for the next Battlefield game in 2020 or 2021 be something that would benefit that title? I believe it would, but it depends on who you really ask. There are some players who do enjoy a good single-player story, but we know that DICE always has limited time to develop their titles, and limited resources as well. I think it would help to create a better Battlefield product if the focus was solely reduced to that multiplayer experience. The amount of development time, resources and money that is spent on creating a single-player campaign experience in any video game is extremely high. Because Battlefield has always been a multiplayer-focused franchise, often the single-player elements feel like they've just been bolted onto the side, and they aren't really that memorable. Is it worth it to spend all of that money, all of that development time and effort on a mode that is arguably only going to be played through once or twice, and then forgotten about by the players that did actually choose to play it? Well, perhaps not. Taking Battlefield 4 as an example, which didn't launch in the greatest state, could that extra manpower that was used to create what was, to me, a very forgettable single-player experience, could that manpower have been used to up the quality level, the polish of the multiplayer at launch? I think it could have. The same could be said for Battlefield 5, which again launched with several issues present within the multiplayer. Perhaps not having the single-player offering might have freed up resources to be used on the multiplayer. Something to consider there, though, is that single-player elements of Battlefield games are often used and structured as minor tutorials. They take players through mechanics and they bring up scenarios that they might experience and end up using in multiplayer. Now, looking at Battlefield 5 as an example, most of this is done within the prologue segment, and that takes all of 10 to 15 minutes to play through. But it probably took thousands of hours to develop. Is it worth creating entire stories, characters, maps, weapons, vehicles, and more, purely so you can walk through players how to drive tanks, or how to fire weapons, or how to blow up that house over there? Could those teachable moments not be made into a much more focused training mode, built into the multiplayer segment of the game that players can complete at their leisure? An average player is only going to need to do something maybe once or twice in a video game before they understand it, and then feel comfortable doing it without much help. Do you need an entire single-player campaign story to be built for those players? Or could those tutorials be transplanted into a simulated multiplayer environment and taught there instead? That's the case with other games. I mean, you can take Apex Legends as a really recent example. Their training mode, albeit very short and sweet, teaches players a lot more about how to play the game in a much shorter space of time. It teaches you how to move your character about and use the sliding function, how to pick up weapons, how to swap weapons, that weapons have recoil that you need to control, that the legends have different abilities, how you can heal yourself, and even more. Apex Legends teaches players the fundamentals without carting them through a single-player story that would have been hugely expensive in terms of cost and development time. Because previous Battlefield single-player campaigns haven't been able to create that emotional impact with the people playing it, you can see why some people don't consider it to be a major part of the experience. They are quite forgettable. Single-player is likely never going to be the main focus of a Battlefield game, and therefore it doesn't ever get the full attention of the development team. Inherently, Battlefield is a multiplayer game. It's always the multiplayer that draws you back in, with the immersive gameplay, the sandbox environment, the destruction, the vehicles, the gunplay, and even more. That's what Battlefield is known for, and DICE knows how to make a damn good multiplayer experience. That's why people keep coming back to the multiplayer. Look at Black Ops 4 as an example of doubling down on what games do best. The gaming community initially ragged on Black Ops 4 for not having a single player, but you can now see that the decision Activision and Treyarch made was actually a good one, because they were able to deliver a solid multiplayer experience alongside their signature co-op zombies mode and hop onto the Battle Royale hype train and deliver Blackout at launch. Battlefield 5, by comparison, released with a less stocked multiplayer than previous titles, a single player that delivered a story after launch, no co-op at all as it was chosen to be delayed and released later, and no Battle Royale until March the following year. Those items you used to see on the back of game boxes like tick box single player, tick box multiplayer, tick box co-op, etc. Battlefield 5 will eventually get all of those things, but it's compromised on quality in certain areas, and it struggled to compete with other titles in the same space because it tried to cover too many bases. I want to look at some other games in the multiplayer space that are thriving and succeeding without added elements, games that solely focus on their multiplayer. I think Battlefield can learn from these types of games. They've been born much more recently and have grown to have extremely dedicated fan bases in a relatively short space of time. First example, Rainbow Six Siege. Primarily a multiplayer-focused shooter, Siege has grown a massive following since it launched back in 2015. A constant stream of updates, content, and the emergence of a popular esports scene has really helped elevate it to a position that other games actually now look up to. The rise of the esports side of things fuels the standard matchmaking of the game, with normal players playing maps and using operators over and over and over again. They're learning the ins and outs to better their own play. And Ubisoft, like any other good developer, rebalances things from time to time to shake things up and keep things interesting. Siege did all of this whilst enduring a fairly mediocre launch, but focused efforts into the multiplayer, kept it fresh, adapted existing content, and played into the elements that players liked, such as the operators and their weapons and gadgets. Siege is now one of the biggest esports scenes that you can find in gaming, and that bet on multiplayer support and structure really paid off for Ubisoft. They committed to something, and they tried to make it the best it can be, rather than splitting their focus. Another great example is Overwatch, which uses a similar hero-style shooter approach, but once again focuses heavily on the multiplayer experience. The lack of a single-player story behind these characters set in a fictional world might have harmed the game without any real context for what's happening, but Blizzard set up this series of promotional videos of the launch characters and created bios for them that allow players to have an understanding of the character. They did that well enough that they didn't need to create a single-player story campaign to give any backstory, the focus being solely on the competitive multiplayer element and the addition of content like new characters, cosmetics, maps, game modes, and seasonal events keeps players coming back time after time. Players have been conditioned to expect support for the multiplayer, with that content arriving regularly, and there's little else to distract Blizzard from doing that well into the future. These are games that I think Battlefield can learn from. Yes, they do less stuff, but they do that stuff really, really well, and I think that's the key difference here. Battlefield does have a great multiplayer experience, and I don't think there's really any other game out there right now that can challenge it when it comes to large player number battles. But it keeps trying to break out of that multiplayer box that it's so good at and offer players different ways to play. Different ways that aren't the core of what Battlefield is. Battlefield is all-out warfare, and the way that's been delivered since the days of Battlefield 1942 has been through the multiplayer. If the next Battlefield game dropped the single-player story element, would that be such a bad outcome if it meant more content for the multiplayer, more focus on the multiplayer? For me, no, that wouldn't be a bad outcome at all, it'd be a good outcome. For other players, it might not be such a welcome move, but that really depends on your opinion on the other elements around multiplayer in Battlefield games. However, in trying to check all of the boxes possible and trying to appeal to as many shooter fans as possible with Battlefield 5, I think DICE and EA forgot about what their core experience is and what people know and expect of Battlefield games. That's the multiplayer. That's why I think the next Battlefield game should be multiplayer only. But thank you very much for watching today, guys. That's pretty much all I've got. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section, and if you liked the video, drop it a like. If you didn't like it, then the dislike button is there for you as well. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more Battlefield 5 coverage, and turn on notifications if you want to know the moment my videos go live. But until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.